The term midlife crisis did not come from pop culture. Long before it became a joke about sports cars and affairs, it was a serious attempt to answer one question. What happens to a mind when it finally understands that time is not infinite? In 1965, a Canadian psychoanalyst named Elliot Jack wrote Death and the Midlife Crisis, arguing that somewhere in our late 30s and 40s, people confront mortality, limitations, and the life they did not live. The version we were given is familiar. A man in a red car, a man leaving his marriage, a man buying something loud and shiny to outrun the clock. That's the story we turned into memes, marriage jokes, and movie plots. But that's not how it started, and it's definitely not the whole story. Jacques sat at the intersection of three worlds: the consulting room, the factory, and the biographies of geniuses. By day, he was a psychoanalyst listening to middle-class professionals talk about boredom, panic, and a sense that the best part of life was already gone. By night, he was studying patterns in the lives of famous creators, composers, painters, writers. He noticed how often their work bent sharply in the middle decades. Styles broke, themes darkened. Some fell into silence. Others exploded into something completely new. He also worked as an organizational consultant, watching managers and executives drift into a fog in their 40s. Loss of energy, sudden dissatisfaction, risky decisions that did not match their earlier stability. To him, these weren't random personal quirks. They looked like a stage. From within psychoanalytic theory, Jacques believed that midlife is when the fantasy of endless time collapses. In childhood and young adulthood, death is abstract, something that happens one day to other people. In midlife, that abstraction shrinks. The body starts sending signals, friends and colleagues get sick, parents age or die. The calendar years behind you and the years ahead of you begin to look uncomfortably similar in length. Jacques argued that this is when many people fully grasp, for the first time, this is not a rehearsal. Most of my major choices are already made. I will not get to live every version of the life I imagined. That collision between mortality, limitation, and unrealized fantasy was what he named as midlife crisis. In his frame, it wasn't childish or silly. It was an existential shock, powerful enough to disrupt work, relationships, and creativity. But theories are shaped by who is visible to the theorist. Look at Jacques's vantage point. The people who could afford long-term psychoanalysis in 1960s were not home health aides or single mothers or factory workers. They were managers, professionals, people with private offices and pensions. The biographies he combed through were mostly of men whose creative struggles were preserved in letters, journals, and critical essays. The workplaces he advised were designed around a standard worker who, in practice, was male, white, full-time, and supported by someone else's unpaid labor at home. So the crisis he described was real, but it was a crisis of a particular class, race, and gender. The man whose life is organized around his individual career, his personal accomplishments, and his sense of heroic potential. His turmoil is treated as a psychological event worthy of study and theory. Meanwhile, the midlife turmoil of women who are holding up the everyday world through caregiving, low-paid work, and invisible coordination is treated as background noise. They are exhausted, resentful, anxious, and stretched thin. But that overload is not written up as midlife crisis. It's labeled stress, attitude, or just life. One of the unspoken truths in Jacques's work is this: having a named midlife crisis is itself a kind of privilege. To have a crisis in the way he describes, you have to have enough control over your time to step back and reflect, enough savings or social support to risk changing course, enough cultural value that your distress is seen as meaningful, not inconvenient. You have to be allowed to fall apart and still be considered a serious person. For many midlife women, especially working class women and women of color, that option doesn't exist. They are not granted the dignity of a crisis. They are handed the expectation of endurance. When they reach the same confrontation with mortality, when they realize dreams they had at 20 will never happen, when their bodies change, their energy cracks, and their responsibilities swell, there is no psychoanalytic paper, no best-selling book, no movie genre waiting to catch that fall. There is just keep going. You got this. It's hard, but so worth it. So when Jaques wrote about midlife crisis, he was not lying. He was describing something real and painful, but he was also helping fix the camera in place on the man whose crisis can be dramatized and solved through personal reinvention, and away from the woman whose crisis has been quietly built into the price of everyone else's stability. That's the friction at the heart of this phrase. Midlife crisis became a cultural story about male individuality, a man's panic, a man's regrets, a man's red car. But in the same years, millions of women were living something just as intense: body changing, money tight, elders and children needing care, careers sidelined by bias and interruption. Their crisis was not framed as crisis, it was framed as duty. And once you see that, it changes what midlife even means. Because to create language that supports a man's realization of mortality and time, without including the people who support him and make that realization possible, is not neutral. It's a decision about whose inner life deserves vocabulary and whose doesn't. Think about what has to be true for a man to have a recognizable midlife crisis in the classic sense. Someone else is picking up the kids from school while he questions everything. Someone else is managing the meals, the appointments, the aging parents, while he wonders if he chose the right career. Someone else's body and schedule are absorbing the everyday impact of his search for meaning. When we invent a term like midlife crisis around his emotional reckoning and leave out the people quietly holding his world together, we do something subtle but powerful. We turn his struggle into psychology and their struggle into duty. His turmoil becomes a story worth telling,
Somewhere in the middle,
theorizing,
everything
and
gets
filming.
questioned.
Theirs becomes, of course she's tired, of course she's stressed, of course she's difficult right now. But that's life. And it's not that he shouldn't have a crisis. It's that women are having one too, at the exact same time, under heavier conditions, with less money, less freedom, less social permission to fall apart. And there is no grand theory, no catchy phrase, no movie genre for
Everything gets
that.
questioned.
So the language wraps warmly around one person's reckoning with time and passes right over the people whose unpaid care, emotional labor, and steady presence give him the room to have that reckoning at all. That's not just an oversight. That's how invisibility is built. And when you finally notice it, midlife crisis stops feeling like a neutral description and starts looking like what it actually is: a partial story told from one side of the table. So, if we're going to talk honestly about midlife, we can't just follow the man to the sports car. We have to turn the camera toward the people who made it possible for him to walk away in the first place. Jack's decision to focus almost entirely on the lives of men is nothing more than typical for his time and for who he was. When identity and validity are placed in the hands of someone who lived deep inside male-dominated hierarchies in the army, factories, and corporate leadership, who believed in fixed levels, layers of capability, and the naturalness of hierarchy, it is not surprising that the lives and challenges of those who support men in those systems become background noise. And that's the part we inherit without noticing. When we say midlife crisis, we are still standing in his hallway, looking through his keyhole. We see the man whose crisis gets a theory and a story arc. We don't see the women whose midlife crisis was treated as duty, hormones, or just life. Which means the real question isn't only what happens to a man at midlife, it's what was happening to everyone around him while his crisis was being named. It was a map of who was allowed to speak and who even counted as a subject worth theorizing. The rooms where Jax presented his ideas were overwhelmingly male, white, and professional. The British psychoanalytic world, the corporate clients he advised, the factory managers he studied. These weren't spaces where a midlife nurse or a housewife caring for aging parents could stroll in and say, "Actually, here's my crisis." So no, you wouldn't see a headline in 1965 that says, "Women seek to be included in Jack's midlife crisis theory." The challenge took a different route. About 10 years later, the phrase that had been quietly sitting in a psychoanalytic journal started its second life in women's hands. In the mid-1970s, journalist Gail Sheehy picked up Midlife Crisis and did something radically different with it. In her bestseller, Passages, Predictable Crises of Adult Life, she used the term to talk about both men and women reassessing their lives, women re-entering work or education, leaving stifling marriages, and men being called to step up at home. Historian Suzanne Schmidt calls this the feminist origin of the popular midlife crisis. When the concept finally gained traction, it described a period when men and women were abandoning rigid gender roles, not just men buying convertibles. In that version, midlife wasn't only a man's panic at the top of the ladder. It was a moment when women were questioning the script they'd been handed. Is housework really my whole life? What happens if I go back to school now? Can I expect more from a partner than good provider? Sheehy's framing made millions of readers, especially women, feel that their unrest was not just hormones or ingratitude, but a predictable stage in adult life, a chance to renegotiate who they were allowed to be. In other words, if Jax coined the term by watching men, feminist writers tried to turn the camera outward, toward everyone orbiting those men. But here's the twist. Over time, that broader, feminist version faded from view. What stuck in the culture wasn't midlife as a chance for women to step into new power. What stuck was the narrower, easier image: a man in a crisis of meaning, a car, a younger partner, a punchline. The concept that had briefly been stretched to include women's upheaval was squeezed back into a story about male indulgence. As Schmidt puts it, the midlife crisis was gradually reconstructed as a chauvinist cliché. So if you trace the history, you get a strange arc. A term coined from the lives of white, middle-class men in positions of authority. A feminist moment where women tried to claim it for themselves. Then a slide back into the sports car stereotype, with women once again off to the side. But even that doesn't tell the whole truth. When we talk about midlife crisis as a male problem, or a suburban housewife's awakening, we're still circling the same neighborhoods: white, middle class, relatively sheltered, different costumes, same racial script. it's worth exploring another question. Where were Black women in this picture? While midlife crisis was being coined, reclaimed, and then flattened into a joke, Black women in their 40s and 50s were living a very different kind of midlife, one shaped by racism, low pay, and nonstop work. Their crisis wasn't named, it was assumed. If you zoom out across US history, one fact jumps off the page. Black women have always worked. Economic historians looking at labor force data from 1870 onward found that Black women were consistently more likely than white women to be in paid work and often in the hardest jobs: agriculture, manufacturing, and domestic service. By the mid 20th century, that pattern hadn't disappeared. Black women in their 30s, 40s, and 50s were more likely than white women to be wage earners, not just helping out, but holding up entire households. At the same time, they were being paid less for it. In 1950, Black women earned, on average, about 60 cents for every dollar earned by white women. So when Jax was studying managers afraid of losing status, and when later white feminists were describing the limitations of suburban housewives, millions of Black women in midlife weren't asking, "Who am I without my career?" or "Is this split level house enough?" They were asking, "Can I keep this job? Will the landlord raise the rent? What happens if my body breaks down before the bills do?" Midlife wasn't a crisis of meaning layered onto comfort. It was a continuation of work layered onto work. On top of that, in the 1960s, as white feminists began to talk about the problem that has no name, the suffocation of educated white women confined to home, Black women were being told something very different. They were told that they were the problem. In 1965, the US government published what's now known as the Moynihan Report, a document on Black poverty that popularized the idea of a Black matriarchy. It framed Black women's roles as heads of households and wage earners as a kind of social defect, evidence that Black families were broken, that Black men had been displaced, that Black culture itself was pathological. So, at almost the same historical moment, white middle-class women were being told, "You're too dependent. You need more selfhood, more work, more voice." Black women were being told, "You're too strong, too independent, too central. You're destabilizing the Black family." The same reality, Black women working and holding families together, was cast as a crisis of patriarchy, not a crisis of exhaustion. You can't have a tidy midlife crisis narrative when your whole adulthood has been treated as either an economic necessity or a moral problem. Imagine a Black woman in her 40s or 50s in the midlife crisis decades, say, late 1950s through the 1970s. She might be working as a domestic worker, nurse's aide, teacher's aide, factory worker, or clerk, caring for children and often grandchildren under one roof, supporting aging parents or relatives who migrated from the South, navigating housing segregation, workplace discrimination, and limited access to credit. Studies of caregiving today still show the echo of that pattern. Black women are more likely to be caregivers than white women, and more likely to provide very high hours of care, over 40 hours a week, on top of paid work. In other words, the classic midlife double shift for women often looks like a triple shift for Black women: paid work, unpaid care, and navigating racism. Where, in that schedule, do you put a socially recognized crisis? Who gives you the time, the money, or the social permission to fall apart? For many Black women, the answer was simple: you don't. You keep going. You may feel all the same questions about purpose, about what your life has added up to. But those questions have to be held while you work, while you care, while you survive. That's not a smaller crisis. It's a crisis with less room. Layered onto this is the body itself. Contemporary research following thousands of women across the menopause transition has confirmed something Black women already knew in their bones. Their midlife bodies are often under more strain. Data from the long-running SWAN study show that Black women reach menopause earlier on average than white women, about 8.5 months earlier, and tend to have more frequent and longer-lasting hot flashes, more sleep disturbance, and higher rates of depressive symptoms during the transition. And yet, despite having more severe symptoms, Black women are less likely to receive hormone therapy, medical treatment, or mental health support for menopause-related issues. So if you zoom back to the era when midlife crisis was entering the culture, you have a concept focused on men's fear of aging and loss of status, a feminist expansion that centered white women's boredom and desire for self-realization, and largely missing from both, Black women hitting the menopause transition earlier in more physically demanding jobs, with fewer healthcare options and more medical bias. In a health system shaped by racism, Black women's pain is often underestimated, their symptoms dismissed, their distress folded into stereotypes about being strong, or angry, or resilient. So again, the pattern repeats. What is a midlife crisis for some becomes just life for Black women. By the late 1960s, some Black women were done waiting to be seen. Writers and organizers began naming what Frances Beale famously called double jeopardy, the reality of being both Black and female in a society organized around white men. Her 1969 pamphlet, Double Jeopardy, To Be Black and Female, dissected how capitalism, racism, and sexism work together to shape Black women's lives. In the 1970s, Black feminists founded the National Black Feminist Organization, NBFO, to address the double burden of racism and sexism and to demand visibility in both the women's liberation and Black liberation movements. Soon after, the Combahee River Collective emerged, articulating a radical Black feminist politics that openly named the interlocking forces of race, gender, class, and sexuality. Their work helped lay the groundwork for what we now call intersectionality. But even in these spaces, midlife crisis wasn't really the headline. Why? Because for many Black women, the crisis wasn't limited to a decade in the 40s or 50s. It was structural and continuous. It started in childhood, in underfunded schools and segregated neighborhoods. It continued in early adulthood, in the jobs available and the wages offered. It intensified in midlife, when bodies began to protest and responsibilities multiplied. Midlife wasn't a new emergency. It was the point where all the earlier emergencies came due. But this wasn't only happening in the United States. In the very country where Jack was writing about midlife crisis, another story was unfolding. After the Second World War, Britain invited people from across the Caribbean and Commonwealth to help rebuild the country. Many of them were women, and thousands were recruited straight into the new National Health Service to plug nursing and support staff shortages. They worked nights and weekends, doing intimate bodily care in an underfunded system, in a cold country, often facing open racism from patients, colleagues, and landlords. By the 1970s, Black British women were beginning to organize and name this reality for themselves in groups like the Brixton Black Women's Group and the Organization of Women of African and Asian Descent, saying, in effect, we are not just support workers in someone else's story. We are dealing with racism and sexism at work and at home. So whether you look at midlife Black women in the US or Black women in Britain's new NHS wards and council estates, the pattern is the same. Their labor was central, their midlife stress was intense, and their crisis didn't get a theory. It got called duty, gratitude, or simply the price of being here at all. So, where does that leave us? Not in a competition over who is allowed a crisis, not in a contest between his pain, her boredom, and their exhaustion. It leaves us with a simpler, harder truth. The way we first named midlife crisis was incomplete, not completely wrong. Men do feel status slipping. Women do feel suffocated. But the introduction was narrow. It was built around people whose suffering was most visible to the people holding the pen. Expanding that story doesn't mean taking anything away from white men or white women. It means being honest about who was left outside the frame and what that did to how we design work, healthcare, and policy. If we're going to keep the phrase midlife crisis, maybe it needs an upgrade. Not just a private panic about getting older, not just a mood or a makeover. A midlife crisis, in the world most of us live in, is what happens when three things collide at once: your body changing, your responsibilities peaking, and the structure around you refusing to budge. For some people, that collision happens in a house with a lot of cushions, savings, therapy, flexible work, social permission to say, "I'm not okay." For others, the collision happens on a night shift, on a bus at 5 a.m., in a clinic where you're not believed, in a family where you can't afford to fall apart. That's not a moral difference. It's a structural one. And if we ignore that, we end up writing policies and stories that comfort one group and demand endurance from another. Why does any of this matter beyond language? Because the definition you start with quietly decides who gets help. If midlife crisis is imagined as a man in a suit staring at a sports car brochure, you design solutions around career coaching, sports, reinvention, maybe a sabbatical. If midlife crisis is imagined as a white woman in a quiet suburban home, you design solutions around returning to work, education, and individual fulfillment. But if you never picture the midlife nurse, the warehouse worker, the home health aide, the single grandmother raising children on a sore back and 3 hours of sleep, then you don't write policies for them. You don't fund workplace changes for them. You don't train doctors to take their symptoms seriously. Their crisis stays renamed as strong, resilient, hardworking, grateful to have a job, which sounds flattering, until you realize it's also a way of saying, we won't redesign anything for you. None of this means that the man in the sports car isn't scared of aging, or that the woman in the quiet house isn't suffocating. Their feelings are real. Their questions matter. What it means is they were never the only ones in crisis. Men can grieve status loss without being the blueprint for what midlife is. White women can question the script they were given without being the only ones in the cast. Black women and indigenous women, all women of color, and working class women of every background can name their midlife crisis without having to shrink it down to fit a story that was never written for them. Once you see that, midlife stops looking like a single dramatic plot twist. It starts looking like a pressure map, showing where the system leans hardest, whose bodies absorb the impact, and who gets a language and a budget line to describe what they're going through. So what do we do with that? One option is to keep using midlife crisis as a punchline and hope the people holding everything together don't drop it. Another option is to treat midlife as predictable infrastructure, not personal failure. to ask in every workplace and every health system, what happens here when people hit their 40s and 50s? Who is carrying the most care, the most physical strain, the most invisible stress? And what would it look like to design around their reality, not just the most comfortable one? That might mean menopause policies at work. It might mean paid leave and flexible hours for midlife caregivers. It might mean training clinicians to unlearn the idea that some women are too strong to need help. It might mean admitting that a crisis isn't always a man's sudden awakening. It's often a woman's long, quiet accumulation. Because words seem small until you realize they decide who gets a day off, a diagnosis, a different schedule, a second chance. If we update the story of midlife to include the people who kept it all running, we're not just changing language, we're changing what becomes possible when the middle of life arrives. Thank you so much for watching. The phrase midlife crisis will probably stay with us. The question is whether it stays as a joke or becomes a doorway into better policy, better care, and better work. Because we don't have to throw away anyone's story of midlife to see how incomplete the picture has been. We just have to widen the frame.